Okay, hello everyone. I'm going to talk a little Egypt today, and as you can see from the title of the presentation, we're going to be focusing once again on art. The period that we're looking at is roughly the period from about 3000 to 1000 BCE, and I'll let you know that there is, under handouts in this week's module, there is an Egypt through the millennia handout, which could be useful just in terms of getting your bearings. So you might want to take a look at that, or even pause it, pause the video, print it out, and resume. So that's the when of our study of ancient Egypt. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the where. I mean, I think most of you probably know roughly where Egypt is located, obviously in northeastern Africa. But I want to take a moment and just point out how important geography can be in terms of the formation of a culture. One thing that you've read about this week, or will read about this week in West in the World, is the way that the harsh climate of Mesopotamia sort of fostered a kind of pessimism among the Mesopotamian people, which colored their religious life, their view of the afterlife, and so on. Egypt is going to be a rather different story. Now, most Egyptians lived in very close proximity to the Nile River, which you can see very prominently there. Unlike the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in Mesopotamia, the Nile River flooded very regularly. You could usually count on the time of year it would flood, and it flooded at a time very propitious for agriculture. And so, between that and the sunny climate and the kind of relative geographical isolation that the Egyptians enjoyed, especially early on in their history, the Egyptians sort of acquired this optimistic view of life. And we'll have several opportunities to talk a little bit about that. One point I want to make real briefly is something that could be confusing: Upper and Lower Egypt. So scholars all the time will talk about Upper and Lower Egypt. And you might assume that Upper Egypt would be, literally up on the map, so north, but it's the reverse. Upper Egypt is southern Egypt, Lower Egypt is northern, but there is a simple explanation for it, and it's simply elevation, okay? The Nile, like any river, is going to flow from higher elevation to a lower elevation, and so Upper Egypt in the south is at a higher elevation, and then Lower Egypt, where the delta is located, is a lower elevation. So, so that explains that possible confusion. All right, so I'm going to focus on two periods of time in Egyptian history, ancient Egyptian history: the Old Kingdom and the New Kingdom. The Old Kingdom, roughly 2700 to 2200 BCE. Is notable for a couple of things. It's notable as a time of peace and prosperity, and as I said a moment ago, relative isolation, not total, but relative isolation from the rest of the world. It was a time of political stability. So Upper and Lower Egypt had been united into one kingdom. So it was a high point in ancient Egyptian history. Not unrelatedly, the Old Kingdom was really the zenith of the power of the pharaohs. And pharaoh, a term meaning great house, was simply the title that Egyptians gave to their king. So there was never a guy named Pharaoh. It's just the honorific title. And during the Old Kingdom especially, pharaohs were seen as having almost absolute power. In contrast to Mesopotamian kings, pharaohs were seen not just as special representatives of the gods, but rather as gods in human form, in particular, the god Horus, who's often depicted as a falcon. So I want to look at a couple of works of art and architecture that are really going to bring this point home, this near absolute power of the pharaoh. The first work I want to look at, let me adjust my screen here, is the palette of Narmer. Now, a palette is something used for cosmetics, but this is an unusually large one. And so probably it's about 2 feet tall, and probably was just used for decoration, not for practical use. Do note the date, right? This is a very, very old work of art and in an incredible state of preservation. Narmer was the first king of the first dynasty of Egypt. And at least, supposedly, he's more of a legendary figure in some ways than a historical one. But what this palette is probably depicting, and by the way, the front of the palette is what you see there on the left, and the back is what you see on the right. And what it's probably sort of symbolizing and telling the story of is the unification of Lower and Upper Egypt. In one image, he's shown wearing the crown of Upper Egypt. In another image, he's shown wearing the crown of Lower Egypt. You also, on the left, have those sort of interlacing necks, which may well symbolize the unification of Lower and Upper Egypt. So one of your study guide questions ask about how the palette of Narmer could be seen as a symbol of power, of kingly power. And I think there are a number of ways we can see this. I mean, basically, you have a bunch of different images meant to very graphically underline the military might, the power, sheer power of Narmer. So if you look on the left hand, not the very top register, but the one below that on the right, you see all these figures kind of stacked on top of each other. And you'll notice there's something between their legs. Those are their heads. Okay, so those are the enemies of Narmer who have been decapitated. And if you look on the right side, so this would be the back, you see Narmer and an enemy on his knees in a totally submissive posture, and is about to be, smoked by Narmer. So lots of images, and you can find other images too of defeated enemies and that sort of thing. So the message of the palette of Narmer is rather clear, which is this is a great figure. You do not want to mess with this guy. This guy absolutely vanquishes all of his enemies. So already we see in the very earliest stages of Egyptian art, we see the way that art serves a kind of political agenda and is a kind of form of political propaganda. But another reason to pay attention to the palette of Narmer is because it's a very good illustration of Egyptian artistic conventions. Egyptian art is generally quite conservative. It has pretty strict rules about things like how the human form should be depicted. And as we'll see, realism, naturalism is not really the top priority. So look, for instance, at the image of Narmer on the right, okay? And you see that he's standing in a position that is really kind of impossible because part of his body is sort of frontal to the viewer, but in other ways, so look at his torso, for instance, look at his eye, but other parts of his body are clearly in profile view. So you look at his legs, you look at his head, and so on. And you'll just see this kind of frontal profile hybrid again and again in Egyptian art. You also see, similarly, sort of these shifting viewpoints. So if you look again at the left, at the front, and you look at that second to the top register, so, when you're looking at Narmer, who's wearing the crown, and you're looking at some of his guard, we're all looking at them sort of from the ground level profile view. But then go back to those decapitated enemies of his. It's almost like we have an aerial view from above of those enemies. So it's not a consistent point of view. I say this not because I think it's a failure on the part of the Egyptian artist, but these were deliberately cultivated artistic conventions that you find in Egyptian art thousands of years after this. You also see, I think, the importance of symmetry here. You see that in the creatures with the interlaced necks, for instance, or the bulls on the very top register of the palette. Again, symmetry might sort of evoke the kind of order and stability that the king brought Egypt. So it's not just the content of the Palette of Narmer that can serve as political propaganda, but the form as well. And a couple of other things that we don't see here that is very consistent with Egyptian art over the millennia. Very little emotion, right? So you look at Narmer's face, or even the face of the guy who's about to, have his lights turned out. No real emotion, and not much interest in creating the illusion of depth. Okay, so these are very sort of two-dimensional works of art. All right, again, these are things that don't just characterize the Palette of Narmer, but Egyptian art as a whole. All right, now I want to turn to the most sort of iconic work of Egyptian architecture, that is the pyramids of Giza. And again, we turn to these not just as examples of Egyptian art, but as vivid illustrations of the sheer power of the pharaoh in the Old Kingdom. Now, these are incredible feats of engineering, and there's all sorts of things we could say about that. And you'll read a little bit about that in West in the World. But I want to focus on the purpose of the pyramids. It's quite simple. These were not really multi-purpose buildings. There was a sole purpose for the pyramids, and that was to serve as tombs for royalty. Okay. So you just think about all of the labor, all of the organization, all the blood, sweat, and tears that went into building these buildings. This is the sheer number of labors, tens of thousands. And you think about the fact that the pharaoh, multiple pharaohs, were able to actually, get these not only get the projects off the ground, but complete them. Hard for me to imagine that the pyramids would have ever been built without this view that pharaohs were gods incarnate. In case you don't believe me, try convincing somebody to build a pyramid for you sometime and see how that goes. Now, already I'll go ahead and mention something that we'll come back to several times. These are, yes, meant to serve as tombs, but not just as any tombs, but tombs that would facilitate the transition of the pharaoh and his family from this life into the afterlife. And this reflects a rather optimistic understanding of the afterlife in ancient Egypt, one that contrasts with that of ancient Mesopotamia. So I want to turn to another work, our last work from the Old Kingdom, that illustrates this optimism about the afterlife. And that is, maybe I'll hang out down there for a while. That is the statues of Prince Rahotep and his wife Nofret. Okay. So again, we're in the Old Kingdom. These are not quite life-size, but they're pretty large. They're about 4 feet tall and painted limestone. One thing that we do see here, since we were just talking about Egyptian artistic conventions, one very common one that we see here has to do with skin tone. So obviously Rahotep has a much darker skin tone than his wife. And this is a typical way of rendering male and female skin tones. Men were expected to be sort of outdoors, working in the sun, living public lives, darker skin. Women were expected to remain indoors most of the time, thus the lighter skin. Before going any further, I think it is worth just pausing for a moment and taking stock of how naturalistic these works of art are. You know, not naturalistic in the sense of a Michelangelo sculpture, perhaps, but compared to everything else that we've seen in the course so far, these are really the most sort of accurate and naturalistic representational sculptures I think that we've seen. All right, now what are these statues exactly? These are Ka statues, K-A. These would be placed in one's tomb, okay? Now, why? Just to remember the person? No, they had a very practical purpose. The ancient Egyptians believed that every person had a Ka, which is a kind of life force. And when the person dies, that their Ka, their life force, is sort of released, uncoupled from the body. And so the Ka needs something to inhabit. These statues provide a kind of vessel for the Ka. And supposedly, you know, priests were able to come into these tombs, bring these statues to life so that they could eat the food and drink offerings that had been left for them. So that's what I mean when I say these had a very practical purpose, because even your Ka after death needs to subsist on food and drink. Okay, so again, notice, you know, Rahotep, not a pharaoh, but he was a member of the royal family. And in the Old Kingdom, yes, there was this optimistic view of the afterlife, but it was pretty much restricted to royalty and royal families. If you were a peasant, you would not necessarily look forward to a joyous afterlife. Again, in the Old Kingdom. Now you're going to read a little bit about the Middle Kingdom, but you know, that's not really our primary concern. So we're going to skip on over to the New Kingdom, which begins around 1570 and is over by 1085 or so. The New Kingdom is a period in which, excuse me, the Egyptians are no longer really isolated from the rest of the world. In fact, they have begun to create an empire that stretched not only, you know, southward into Africa, but also northward into Asia as well. So this represents sort of the apex of the political and economic power of Egypt, the New Kingdom. But the New Kingdom is also notable for several of its pharaohs. Some of the most famous pharaohs who ever lived and ruled during the New Kingdom. And one of these is Hatshepsut. Now, Hatshepsut was, by all accounts, a very good pharaoh, notable for a very impressive temple building program. But the thing that's most notable about Hatshepsut is that Hatshepsut was a woman. Now, that was not absolutely unheard of in ancient Egypt, but it was unusual for the pharaoh to be a woman. Now, of course, you look at this sculpture, which is found in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. It's larger than life size, about 8 feet tall. And you would never know, of course, from this that Hatshepsut was a woman. Now, was Hatshepsut trying to fool people into thinking that she was a man? I don't think so. I think that was very much common knowledge. I think the point that this statue is trying to get across is the fact that Hatshepsut is a woman is really kind of irrelevant. What's relevant is the fact that Hatshepsut is the person inhabiting the great house of the kingship. Remember, Pharaoh means great house. Okay, so she is depicted not in such a way as to accentuate either her gender or, you know, her particular looks, but to underline the continuity of her rule with all the pharaohs, mostly men, who would come before her. And again, I wanted to show this statue because we see conventions that we see in scores of other works of Egyptian art. The frontal view, the hands down by the sides, the left foot stepping forward, the ceremonial beard and headdress. These are things that you will see again and again and again. The lack of emotion, right? That's something I've already commented on. But again, much like the paladin armor, it's a symbol of power, which is expressed by the emotionless, expressed by the size, by the fact that she is stepping forward into the world. All right, so Hatshepsut, very famous and in some ways very unusual pharaoh. And the last pharaoh I want to mention is in some ways the most unusual of them all, and that is Akhenaten. Okay? Akhenaten. Akhenaten, you're going to read about him. And Akhenaten was a pharaoh during the 14th century BC. And what he is most notable for is the religious revolution that he initiated. Now, turns out it's not really going to be a revolution that will outlast his own life. So after he dies, things kind of go back to normal. But his revolutionary idea was this: there's only one true God, which in the ancient world was seen as a crazy idea. I mean, you know, only the Israelites believed that. Akhenaten believed that. He believed that the one God was Aten, A-T-E-N, the sun god. And he was the only God. So not just the God for the Egyptians, but he was the only God. And in this image we see here, you see Aten, you see that disk of the sun and the rays coming out from it. Again, it's hard to know how he came up with this idea, why he tried to implement it. You'll read a little bit about that in West in the World. At any rate, he ends up building an entirely new city dedicated to the worship of the god Aten. And that city is known as Amarna, A-M-A-R-N-A. So there's a question on your study guide about sort of the art of the Amarna period. So that's where that word comes from. It's the city that he built in honor of Aten. And when we look at artistic representations of Akhenaten, you can see that his religious views were not the only thing sort of offbeat about Akhenaten. If you look at this image, you know, I've been talking all along about, you know, these very conservative artistic conventions that the Egyptians perpetuated. And, you know, some of them are here, to be sure, like the frontal eye and the profile head. But by any standard, this is a very unusual Egyptian work of art. Unusual both in terms of style and unusual in terms of the very subject matter. So in terms of style, you've got all these curving lines, and Egyptian art tended to be much more sort of linear and rigid. And so the way that Akhenaten and his wife Nefertiti and their children are depicted is quite unusual in that respect. Then you also have, what's actually being depicted here, which is not, to put it crudely, Akhenaten looking tough. It's Akhenaten, at home with the family on Saturday morning, doting on his children. He's even got a little bit of a paunch there. So this is dad art. And one can't help but think that this very depiction is tied up in his religious revolution, right? Because remember, prior to Akhenaten, pharaohs were seen as living embodiments of Horus. And in a way, what this work of art is doing is demystifying the pharaoh. The pharaoh is not presented to us as a god in human form, but as this sort of purely human figure, enjoying the blessings of the god Aten, to be sure. And so perhaps he has a special relationship to Aten. But this is not the kind of thing that we see in a lot of earlier art. And then if we turn to it's not our final, it's our penultimate work of art, the bust of Nefertiti, his wife. Again, we see the way that she is really depicted as a particular, distinctive human being. So, I talked about naturalism when we were looking at Prince Rahotep and Nofret, but this work of art, I think, is got to be one of the most naturalistic works of art that human beings had produced up to this point in history. I mean, I think it's safe to say we are a long way from the Venus of Willendorf here. She's presented as in a very noble, regal, dignified way. But she's also presented as a woman, not as a goddess. All right, the one last point I want to make about the New Kingdom. I talked earlier about how in the Old Kingdom, there was this optimism about the afterlife, but the optimism was basically restricted to royalty, to the elite. Well, in the New Kingdom, there's evidence that that optimism about the afterlife began to spread to lower sectors of society. And I think that's what we see here in this work, Nebamun Hunting Birds. This is a wall painting from the tomb of Nebamun. Now, Nebamun was not a pharaoh. He was not a member of the royal family. He was a court official. So, he's not nobody. He's not a peasant, but he's also not truly an elite. But what we're seeing in this painting, keeping in mind that it's in his tomb, is a kind of picture of the afterlife that Nebamun is hoping for. An afterlife that in many ways is a continuation of this life, but so much better. So, what's he doing? He's hanging out with his family, he's hunting. These are very sort of mundane activities. But I mean, look at the sheer volume of the game. Look at how huge those fish are at the bottom. So, it's sort of afterlife as everyday life on steroids. You take the best day you've ever had in this life and you multiply it times 10. So this is, I think, something increasingly common in the New Kingdom for ordinary people to have higher hopes about life after death. Okay, that covers the ground that I wanted to, so I will see you all soon.